The gym was polished like a movie set. Walls of mirrors, chrome machines, and the scent of eucalyptus towels. It was a place where the rich came to sweat quietly. And then the door opened. In walked a quiet, older black man. His clothes were plain. His steps were slow. His shoulders looked tired. He didn't wear the latest sneakers, no gold chains, just a soft smile and a small bag in hand. Some young men on the bench press looked over and snorted. One nudged the other. "Lost, old man?" one said loud enough for others to hear. Laughter. The man didn't react. He placed his towel on a bench and started stretching gently, one leg at a time. He winced. His left knee was stiff. No one knew he was Sergeant Alan Brooks, a 68-year-old retired Army veteran who had just finished a long round of physical therapy after surgery. He had one goal: move again without pain. No one knew his story, but someone had noticed. Someone who had been watching silently from the corner. Jason Statham. Jason Statham wasn't training for a role today. No cameras, no crew, just him, some heavy weights, and the soft hum of focus. But the moment he heard the laughter, he paused mid-rep. He looked across the gym. The older man hadn't said a word back. He hadn't defended himself. He just rubbed his knee and kept stretching. Jason's eyes narrowed. He'd seen this before, on movie sets, in training camps, and in real life. The quiet ones often had the deepest stories, and the ones who laughed the loudest usually had no idea who they were mocking. Jason racked his weights, wiped his hands, and stood tall. The room buzzed again as the older man moved to the leg press. His motions were slow, controlled, but each press was a win. Each movement a victory against pain. The same group of men laughed again. One even pulled out his phone to record. Jason clenched his jaw. He started walking toward them. Not fast, not loud, but with purpose. Jason stopped just a few feet behind the laughing group. One of them turned and did a double take. "Wait, is that..." Jason didn't smile. He pointed toward the older man, still struggling at the leg press. "Do you know who that is?" Jason asked quietly. The room fell still. Even the background music felt like it disappeared. "His name is Sergeant Alan Brooks," Jason continued. "He served in the Army for over 30 years. He was injured in a rescue mission most of you wouldn't last 5 seconds in." The young men looked down. One lowered his phone. Jason stepped closer. He was shot twice and saved 3 of his men that day. He didn't ask for applause. He never bragged. He just showed up. The old man didn't react. His eyes stayed forward. But they shimmered. Jason's voice softened. "You laugh at him, but you couldn't walk a mile in his shoes. He's more man than any of us here." The gym was dead silent. A trainer near the smoothie bar had tears in her eyes. And slowly, very slowly, people began to understand. Jason took a slow breath, then walked over to Sergeant Alan Brooks. The older man looked up, confused. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped sweat from his forehead. Jason knelt beside him, not in pity but in respect. "I saw what they did," Jason said softly. "You didn't deserve that." Alan smiled faintly. "It's all right. I've been through worse." As Alan stood up slowly, Jason noticed the tattoo on his forearm. It was faded but clear. 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. Jason had trained with real soldiers for his movie roles. He knew what that unit meant. He knew how tough those men were. "You were airborne?" Jason asked. Alan nodded. "For 12 years. Then I became a combat medic. Retired at 58. 2 surgeries later, I'm just trying to walk normal again." Jason's throat tightened. The gym had gone quiet. Even the arrogant lifters were now watching, but not laughing. They were beginning to understand. Jason offered a seat, but Alan shook his head. "If I sit now, my knee locks up." They stood side by side as if they'd trained together. Jason asked gently, "You ever think of giving up?" Alan chuckled softly, a sound full of pain and strength. "Every day, but I buried too many friends to stop now." He looked down for a second. "I saw things over there I can't forget. Some men younger than my grandkids, gone in seconds." Jason's eyes watered. He tried to blink it away. Alan continued, "They'd give anything for one more walk, one more breath, so I walked for them." The gym felt like a church now, still, sacred. Even the lifters who had mocked him earlier stared at the ground, ashamed. Jason turned to them. "This man's a hero, and all you saw was a limp and cheap shoes." No one spoke. One of them took off his headphones. Alan looked around slowly, then whispered, "I didn't come here for pity. I came here because I want to live again." Jason nodded. "And that's exactly what you're doing." One of the trainers stepped forward, a tall young man who had earlier joined in the laughter. He cleared his throat. "Sir, I'm sorry. We didn't know." Alan nodded but didn't say anything. Jason turned to the others. "He's not looking for attention. He's looking for peace. You mocked him while he fought his own war silently." Then Jason stepped aside and motioned to the leg press machine. "Let him finish his set." Alan looked around. His hands shook a little. His eyes were wet, but his heart felt full. He sat back down and started pressing again. Each push slow but stronger now. The room stayed silent. Jason stood close, not as a bodyguard, but as a brother. In that moment, Alan Brooks wasn't just a veteran. He was a symbol of courage, of quiet strength, of unseen battles. And for the first time in years, someone truly saw him. Jason whispered, "You don't need applause, Sergeant, but you sure deserve it." The gym remained still, and slowly, a few people began to clap. As Alan pressed the weight for the last time, the room still watched in silence. One man, about Jason's age, whispered, "He reminds me of my father." Jason heard it. He turned toward the voice. "My dad came back from Vietnam," the man said. "Never talked much, but he had the same eyes, like he saw too much." Jason nodded. "Pain never really leaves, but respect can help heal it." Alan stood, holding his towel. His breath was heavy, but his spine stood straighter now. Jason walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You just taught this room more in 5 minutes than most people learn in a lifetime." Alan gave a small smile. "I didn't come here to teach. I came to move again, one step at a time." From the back, one young man who had laughed earlier walked forward. "Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't know." Alan looked at him calmly. "You didn't ask." And suddenly, everyone understood how deep that sentence was. Jason helped Alan over to the stretching mats. As the veteran sat down, his shirt lifted slightly, revealing a long curved scar along his side. Jason gently asked, "That from battle?" Alan nodded. "I was pulling a wounded man out of a truck. It exploded." The gym felt colder now, still bright but heavy with truth. Jason sat beside him. "You never told anyone?" Alan shook his head. "Who would listen? People just see an old man, limping, sweating, weak." Jason's voice softened. "I see strength, real strength." One of the gym staff brought Alan a cold towel. She knelt down beside him, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for your service," she said. "I never said it to anyone before." Alan looked up, touched. "That means more than you know." Jason turned to the room. How many more walk among us like him? Quiet heroes we overlook? The question sat in the air like a weight no one could lift. And for the first time, some of the young men truly looked ashamed. Jason didn't leave Alan's side. He sat close, not to protect, but to honor. He didn't need bodyguards. His silence was enough. Alan lay back on the mat to stretch his legs. His breathing was slow, deep, but tears were in his eyes. "I thought this world had forgotten us," he whispered. Jason shook his head. "Not today." Behind them, one of the earlier mockers took off his gym shirt and placed it over the phone he had used to record. Then he walked to the trash and tossed the phone in. He didn't need it anymore. A young woman approached and asked Alan, "Can I shake your hand?" Alan reached out. She squeezed it gently. Then others followed, one by one. Not fans, but citizens paying silent tribute. Jason stood like a statue, not acting, not speaking for cameras, just being present. Alan looked up. "You didn't have to step in," Jason replied. "Yes, I did. The world is loud with pride. It needs more people who speak through action." And in that quiet gym, hearts began to change. Alan sat quietly, his towel draped over his lap, the room still filled with respectful silence. A young man, maybe in his 20s, walked over nervously. His voice shook. "Sir, my grandfather served too, but I never knew how to talk to him. He was always quiet, like you." Alan looked up. "Sometimes silence is where the pain hides." The young man nodded, then without thinking, he leaned down and gave Alan a hug. Alan's body stiffened at first. Then he slowly wrapped his arms around the boy. "I haven't been touched like that since the war," Alan whispered. Jason looked down, blinking back tears. Everyone in the gym saw what just happened. It wasn't just a hug. It was healing. A man who once looked broken now looked lifted. And the boy? He walked away, wiping his eyes. Jason said softly to Alan, "You're helping strangers without even trying." Alan smiled with a single tear on his cheek. "Maybe that's the best kind of help." Jason Statham had fought villains on screen, raced cars through explosions, and jumped out of helicopters. But what he did next was more powerful than all of that. He knelt, right there, on the gym floor in front of Alan Brooks. A Hollywood icon worth millions, respected around the world, knelt down quietly. Not as an actor, but as a man. "I don't know if I've earned the right to call you brother," Jason said softly, "but I hope one day I can." Alan looked shocked. His lips trembled. "You don't have to kneel for me, son." Jason smiled. "I don't do this for you. I do it for the ones who never made it back, and the ones still hurting." The room held its breath. Then a trainer nearby, who had once laughed earlier, removed his cap and knelt too. One by one, more followed. No music, no noise, just a room full of people, showing respect. Alan's eyes were full of tears. His voice barely came out. "I thought this world had forgotten how to feel." Jason replied, "Not if I have anything to say about it." Just as things became quiet again, the front door opened. It was the gym manager, Mr. Keller, a tall man in his 60s, known for his cold rules and sharp voice. He looked around, confused. Half the gym was kneeling. Others were standing still with wet eyes. Jason was helping Alan stretch gently on the mat. "What is going on here?" he asked. No one spoke. Jason stood and walked over. "Something special happened today," he said calmly. Mr. Keller frowned. "This isn't a church. It's a gym. People come here to work out, not cry on the floor." Alan slowly pushed himself up and faced the manager. "I came here to walk again, that's all. But your gym gave me something more." Mr. Keller crossed his arms. "You don't have a membership, sir." Jason's eyes narrowed. "He does now." He pulled out his black card, the one he never used. "Lifetime, on me. And if anyone here has a problem with that, I'll train somewhere else." The room froze. Mr. Keller looked around, then slowly nodded. "Welcome to the gym, Sergeant Brooks." And with that, the mood shifted again. Alan had earned his space, not with money, but with quiet courage. Alan sat on the bench again, wrapping his towel slowly. Jason stayed nearby. An older man, maybe in his 70s, stepped forward. He had gray hair and watery eyes. He looked at Alan carefully. "I served too," the man said, "but I never told anyone. Vietnam, 1971. Came back to protest. Not thanks." Alan stood. The two veterans looked at each other. Their hands shook as they met in a slow handshake. The old man wiped his eye. "When I saw the flag on your bag, I felt proud again. That's my flag too." Jason stepped back, letting the moment speak for itself. He wasn't the star here. These two men were. Others watched quietly. A young woman whispered to her friend, "My granddad never talked about the war. Maybe he was hurting like that." Alan looked around and said gently, "We all carry wounds. Some you see, some you don't. But respect, that heals." Jason nodded. "And you've done more healing here today than any doctor could." The room remained still. No clanking weights, no idle talk, just heartbeats and silence. Jason helped Alan sit again, noticing the worn gym bag beside him. "Mind if I grab your water?" Jason asked. Alan nodded. As Jason opened the bag, something fell out. A small velvet box. It landed softly on the mat. Jason picked it up. "You dropped something, Sergeant." Alan looked at it, then paused. "That's my silver star. I keep it with me, just to remind myself I survived." Jason's hands tightened around the box. He opened it carefully. Inside, the metal shimmered under the gym lights. Someone whispered, "Is that real?" Jason stood, holding it high. "This is the Silver Star, third highest military decoration." He didn't buy it. He earned it. A gasp echoed through the room. Alan looked down. "I never talk about it. I was just doing my job." Jason closed the box and gave it back. "That's what makes you a hero, Sergeant. Not the medal, the silence behind it." Several lifters lowered their heads. One even wiped a tear. The gym wasn't just a place to lift weights anymore. It had become a place to lift hearts. Alan stood again, slowly but stronger now. Jason walked with him toward the exit. "I didn't mean to take over your gym time," Alan said almost shyly. Jason shook his head. "You gave me more than any workout ever could." A young woman who had watched everything walked forward, her hands shaking. "Sir, I was going to quit today. Life's been hard, but you saved me today." Alan looked surprised. "Me?" She nodded through tears. "You reminded me that pain is part of the journey, that hope still lives." Jason's eyes filled again. He placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "That's why we don't ignore the quiet ones." Alan smiled softly. Sometimes all it takes is one kind word to change a day. The young woman hugged Alan. Then others joined, one by one. A circle of strangers, now touched forever. Jason stood in the middle, not as a celebrity, but as a witness to something bigger than fame, something holy thing. Alan reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. The edges were torn. The ink had faded. Jason, curious, asked gently, "What's that?" Alan looked down. "A letter from my daughter. She passed 2 years ago. Cancer." The room froze again. "I carry it everywhere," Alan said, voice breaking. "She used to say, 'Daddy, you're my hero. Don't stop walking.'" He held up the paper with both hands. "This is what kept me going after the war, after losing her, after the surgery." Jason looked down, his hands in fists, holding back tears. "She'd be proud of you today." Alan smiled through the pain. "I hope so." Someone nearby began crying quietly. Then another. The gym became a room full of soft sniffles and broken hearts. Alan slowly stood. "I came in here just trying to walk again. and somehow I found pieces of myself I thought I lost. Jason stood beside him. Sometimes we find healing where we least expect it. And with that, they walked side by side to the gym's exit. Every step Alan took now stronger than the last. As Jason and Alan reached the door, the gym owner stepped forward again. "I need to say something," he said. His voice cracked. "I lost my brother in Afghanistan. I never got to say goodbye." He looked straight at Alan. "Watching you today felt like getting a second chance." Jason turned. "Nothing that happened today was an accident." Alan nodded. "Maybe pain brings people together in a way nothing else can." One of the younger lifters who had mocked him earlier raised his hand. "I signed up for the gym to get stronger, but I think I was weaker than I knew." He looked at Alan. "You're the strongest man I've ever met." Alan chuckled softly. "No, I'm just a man who refuses to give up." Jason placed his hand on Alan's back. That's strength most people never reach. People in the gym began clapping, slow at first, then louder, not for fame, not for a show, but for a man who reminded everyone what it means to truly live. And Alan, now standing taller than he had in years, let the tears fall. Alan turned to face the room one last time. He held his cane gently, but didn't lean on it. He looked at every face, young, old, rich, famous, broken, healing. And then he spoke. "I may never come back here again, but if you remember one thing, remember this. There are thousands of men and women like me, silent, hurting, forgotten. Please don't forget us." Jason nodded beside him. "This gym will never be the same, and neither will we." Alan looked over and smiled. "Neither will I." As they stepped outside, the sunlight hit Alan's face. He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Not because of fame, not because of a medal, but because for one afternoon, someone saw him. Someone listened. Someone cared. And for everyone in that gym, something changed forever. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell us, who is the quiet hero in your life? Your story might just help someone else heal too. Because sometimes, the strongest people are the ones we walk past every day. Let's never walk past them again.